Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first Meet the Author event for the new year of 5782. This program is sponsored by Addis Israel and Congregation Beth. Many of you belong to these synagogues or other communities in the DC area, but some of you are from places far from DC. All of you are most welcome. I'm Robin Jacobson, the librarian at Addis Israel. I also co-facilitate Bethel's book club together with Marge London, who's smiling at you from the other box on your screen. If you would like subtitles for this program, push the live transcript button, which is probably located at the bottom of your screen. This afternoon, we are delighted, really beyond delighted, to welcome MIT professor Dr. Sherry Turkle. She is joining us from Boston to talk about her new memoir, Empathy Diaries, about growing up in Jewish Brooklyn and the experiences that inspired her pioneering research into people and computers. In honor of Sherry Turkle and as a salute to Rockaway Beach in New York, where she spent many childhood summers, my Zoom background is of Rockaway bungalows, even if they're not the ones that Sherry and her family stayed in. Marge tried to give you a Zoom background from Paris, but we had some tech difficulties. However, she is proudly wearing an outfit with French soutache embroidery, which was a favorite jacket decoration of a famous French psychoanalyst in Empathy Diaries. A word about coming attractions. Next month on Sunday, November 14th at 4 p.m., we'll discuss Letters to Commando by the artist Edmund de Waal, who also wrote The Hare with the Amber Eyes, a special book club book for us several years back. Letters to Commando is about an exquisite house museum in Paris and the Jewish family who donated this home to France. The book is about art, about the impulse to collect and cherish objects, and about French Jews and World War II. It's also a short book, which is an extra inducement to try it. And then on Sunday, December 12th at 11, we'll welcome the biographer journalist Anne Seba to talk about Ethel Rosenberg. In 1953, after a sensational trial that rocked the world, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were executed for spying for the Soviet Union. All these years later, with more records available, Seba investigates whether Ethel was actually guilty and what role anti-Semitism, attitudes about women, and Cold War fear played in the trial. Looking further ahead, we have a program on Abraham Joshua Heschel, the legendary Jewish thinker and social activist, on February 6th at 11. The links to register for these Zoom programs are in the chat box. If you register early, you won't miss any of the nifty bonus materials that we start sending out several weeks before the program. As for the Sherry Turkle bonus drops, worry not. If you registered for today's program too late to receive them and would like them, you can email me after the program. And now Marge will introduce Dr. Sherry Turkle. Oh, you are muted, Marge, but that is okay because I have to give you the spotlight.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm so used to saying good morning that good afternoon is hard. I found Empathy Diaries fascinating to read. So I'm thrilled that Dr. Sherry Turkle is visiting us and honored to introduce you to her. Sherry Turkle is the Abby Rockefeller Mosey Professor of the Social Studies of Science and Technology at MIT and the founding director of the MIT Initiative on Technology and Self. Professor Turkle received a joint doctorate in psychology and sociology from Harvard University and is a licensed clinical psychologist. For decades, Dr. Turkle has been at the forefront of research and writing about people's relationships with computers and the impact of digital technology on our lives and culture. Her newest book, The Empathy Diaries, published this past March by glowing reviews, is a memoir that links her personal story with her groundbreaking investigations into technology Empathy, and Ethics. Her previous books include the New York Times bestseller, Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in a Digital Age, and other acclaimed books about the impact of digital culture on child development, human relationships, and work productivity. Profiles of Professor Turkle have appeared in the New York Times, Scientific American, Wired Magazine, and other publications. She was named Woman of the Year by Ms. Magazine. Dr. Turkle is a frequent media commentator on social and psychological effects of technology. She has appeared on all the major stations and elsewhere. We feel privileged to have her visit us today. Politics and Prose, our local independent bookstore, is offering a 10% discount on Empathy Diaries to event participants. The link will be in the chat. And now we'll chat with Sherry about her life and work, followed by your questions. Please go ahead, Robin.
Okay, let me just fix all the spotlights.
Spotlight, Robin.
Okay.
There.
Now we have Sherry, and now I'm here with you too. My pleasure. So thank you, Marge, and welcome, Sherry. Like Marge, it's our pleasure. Like Marge, I loved Empathy Diaries, and that book led me to some of your earlier work and your interviews, all riveting. So first, before I do anything else, I'm just going to start by sending waves of admiration in your direction for your life and work. So I hope you feel that reaching you in Boston.
I do. I do.
One of the things that I appreciate the most that's relevant today is that from the outset, you chose to share your research on computer culture, not just with an academic audience, but with the public, with parents, teachers, business people, the people who most directly benefit from your warnings about overuse of digital devices. And your visit to us today, a synagogue group, I think is an example of that ethic, and we thank you for that. So, a question. So first, about the memoir. Let me ask you about the impetus to write a memoir. I've heard you say that one of the reasons you wrote Empathy Diaries is that you always wanted to read this kind of book. What did you mean by that?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. It's really a pleasure to be here, in particular to speak with a synagogue book, because although this book is not only a Jewish book, it is very much a book written by a Jew about a Jewish experience, in some ways about an immigrant experience, although I'm not an immigrant and even my grandparents were not immigrants, but it's the story of an immigrant experience because it takes me from a very insular Jewish world into a larger world. And I think it captures something about the immigrant experience of Jews. So I'm particularly happy to be speaking to a Jewish community. But why my memoir and why did I always want to read a book like this is that I think that there's passion behind people's work, when people do work that compels them. There's great passion behind that scientific work. And in science, in social science, as well as the natural sciences, we're trained to hide that passion. And that's too bad, because when we show what stands behind that passion, I think our audience learns and can appreciate more about really what it takes and who they're learning from. And I've always wanted to read the story behind the story of thinkers who clearly deeply cared about the message they were telling. And all my life, I've been trying to tell a story about the costs of digital culture. And not that I didn't love it, not that there weren't wonderful things about it, but my research came up with a story about its costs. In particular, the way it has assaulted certain kinds of empathic responses. And I wanted my readers to know that why empathy was so important a value for me. And so I wanted to tell the story behind the story because I've always wanted to read a book like that. So I always knew that someday I would be ready to tell my story.
And we feel so lucky that you did. I'm going to turn to that book now. So in Empathy Diaries, you reveal that in your childhood, you were expected to keep many secrets. There was one huge secret and then some smaller ones. Could you tell us about that?
Yes. Well, the title Empathy Diaries is a little ironic. It sort of could be called the anti-empathy diaries because I tell a story. I was very loved as a child, but the people who loved me did not show enough empathy toward me because they asked me to keep a secret that was very destructive to me. They asked me to not say or mention or make any reference at all to the identity of my biological father. My mother had been married to my biological father, and she divorced him when I was 2. And when she remarried, I was to pretend that her new husband, Milton Turkle, who did not adopt me until many years later, was my biological father, and that the new children she had with him were my biological sister and brother. Now, I knew all of this to be false, but I was to pretend that I was Sherry Turkle, even though at school I had to write the name Sherry Zimmerman because legally I was Sherry Zimmerman. But then when I came home, I had to hide all of my books so that no one would see this true name. And I had to pretend that Milton Turkle was my biological father. And we were one sort of happy family so that my mother could hide the fact of this early marriage, which she found shameful in her community. And she could hide the fact of my true parentage, the fact that I had another father. The divorce, the remarriage were treated as crimes, and I was the crime. And this secret, which was, I kept this secret until I was 35 years old. And then finally it came out. And I decided to go public in a very dramatic incident because my mother was so intent on this not being part of her story and that I was the one who could out her was really the defining mark of my life. And there was a tremendous irony because the first topic of my research was the study of a French psychoanalyst whose theory was the importance of the father's name, le nom du père, Jacques Lacan. And for those people who were not sure if Freud's theory of the unconscious has any merit, I will just say, and I discuss in the book, that I did not make the connection that I studied the name of the father until very late in my studies of Jacques Lacan did it occur to me that I was studying the very thing that had defined my childhood. And I just blissfully went on studying this without making that connection. So I am an example of how repression, in fact, has a place in life. And then, of course, there's a very dramatic moment when I say, "Oh, fuck," and I break down, and realizing that I am repressing the key to it all. But my mother felt very strongly that this secret needed to be kept, and that I was the evidence of this terrible secret. And that is was not empathic. That was not empathic.
No, a terrible burden to put on a
burden.
child. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so one of the themes of the book is this regime of secrets and what that can do to a child, and what it did to me,
So, yeah, we're grateful that you surmounted that and used it to fuel your career rather than to become bitter. So, staying with your childhood.
May I say something?
Oh, please.
But I think that it's very important that the secret, that there are tremendous contradictions in my childhood that I really try to explore, that although there was this secret, and I knew that there was something wrong with me, I was also loved, deeply loved, by the people who were asking me to keep this secret. And so what this led to was, instead of my becoming a kind of fatally damaged, it led to a kind of curiosity. Why do these people who love me so want me to do this terribly odd thing? So it led to a kind of desire to be empathic with them, these odd adults who loved me so. And if you read the book, you see the many ways in which they show their love and demonstrate their love and are so on my side. And it's that combination of deep love and asking me to do this terribly odd thing that leads me to a kind of deep curiosity and need to put myself in their place to figure out the mystery of why people who loved me so would behave so oddly. So that's the kind of connection that allows me to become empathic, as you say, rather than bitter and, I don't know, twisted in some way that would have led to deep trouble, serious trouble.
Yes. Yeah. The book makes very clear that those four grown-ups in your life, they adored you. They absolutely adored you. And I can see that. I've heard you say that you had to become kind of a detective in your own life to figure out how could they so love you and yet burden you with this terrible secret.
Yes.
So, but sticking with the childhood, and like you were talking about how your book was so Jewish. One of the ways it seemed to me it was very Jewish was it seemed to me that your grandparents lived with a lot of nervousness because they were Jewish, but that also had some connections to the lessons that they kept wanting to teach you about privacy and democracy, that your grandmother seemed to be repeating lessons to you at the mailbox and at the library, and that those values seem to remain a yardstick for you as far as evaluating the digital world. So I wondered if you could tell us about your grandparents, about those values.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, my grandmother, when my mother was divorced, when I was 2 from my biological father, Charles Zimmerman, we went to live with my grandparents, with her mother and father, and what at the time was called a maiden aunt, her sister, my maiden aunt, um, Mildred Bonowitz, who was one of the great heroes of the book. Um, a very political, very brilliant, um, very intellectual woman who supported me in my desire to read, to learn, to study. And my grandmother was in her way, a very political woman. And I remember her telling every morning from when I was 2, we would go down to the mailboxes together to get the mail. It came twice a day in Brooklyn. I think it might have come 3 times a day, actually, but I remember 2 visits to the mailboxes in the morning and the afternoon. And I went down with her to the mailboxes, and she would say to me, look at these mailboxes. In the old country, the mail was the place they spied on you. In this country, it is a federal offense to look into the mail. The mail is private. And that's why we're in America. It is a federal offense to look at the mail. The mail is private. And she was so proud of being, she didn't mention J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, I'm not going into the, I don't want to go into the ways in which my grandmother was, missing some details here. But what she was communicating was the link between privacy and democracy, and her pride that she was in a place where you could have political opinions and express them in this country. Because my aunt during college had been a political radical. And my grandmother was always a little bit afraid for her. But she felt that she was protected by the American political system, in which you could speak, you could use the mail, and they would not come for you. There were ways to express yourself, and they would not come for you. And that's why we were here. That there was a protection for speech, and Jews could be not afraid the way we had always historically been. And she made me an American, a civil libertarian, a kind of political activist at those mailboxes. And this connection between objects, mail, free speech stayed with me as I saw how the internet was going in the absolutely opposite direction. I mean, the first thing to fall on the internet was email, which became sort of like anybody can look at it. Any one of my hackers at MIT could break into anything as early as, and it was never protected. Email was never protected. It was always treated as though it were not mail, as though it were, not mail.
Right.
And and I always remembered that the early internet gurus would say things like, if you don't have anything to hide, why do you care what's in your mail? Which is the opposite of my grandmother's lessons. The opposite of my grandmother's lessons. I mean, it's so I'm very aware that we think with the objects around us, and the way we've created the objects of digital culture have had such a detrimental effect on the way in which we've built digital culture. We have not built them to reinforce democracy. We've built them, in fact, to undermine democracy. That's been one of the major themes of my work.
Right. Very, very sobering.
Very sobering. I mean, we see the effect of that now.
Yeah. We'll come later to whether it's too late to.
It's never too late.
Never too late.
One of my favorite lines, every author has favorite lines that they've written. And one of my favorite lines is from a TED Talk that I gave. And my favorite line is, just because we grew up with the internet, we think that the internet is all grown up. And it's not. It's early days. Just because we grew up with the internet, we think that the internet is all grown up. I worked for a week on that line, and it's a fallacy. It is not all grown up. It is early days.
It is
early days. It is, and it's so true because we grew up with it, so we think it's old, like we are.
Right.
Because we're old, it must be old. It's a baby. It's a baby. It's time to get it right. When we were growing up with it, we didn't have any idea what it would be good for. Now we have a little bit of a sense, and it's time now to make it what it should be.
Yes.
I mean, now we see how it can undermine democracy, it can undermine privacy, it can undermine our country, it can undermine empathy. Now it's time to get it right. Anyway, end of editorial.
Right. Maybe, yes. Maybe we've grown up a little bit too.
Maybe we've grown up,
in
right?
Love with the internet. Maybe we have
right.
Maybe
we're less smitten, right?
Less smitten. So I'm going to turn back to your mother because and about reconciling with your mother.
Yes.
For me, that was one of the most moving aspects of Empathy Diaries, that you reconciled with her, even though it was years after her death. And I think one of the reasons it hit me was that working in a synagogue, I often hear rabbis say that the death of a parent doesn't end the relationship, that the relationship is still dynamic and ongoing, and that your understanding of your parent continues to develop and grow as you grow and change, even though the parent, sadly, is no longer growing and changing, but you are. But I'm not sure I've ever heard of a more dramatic example of someone reconciling with a parent after her death than yours. And maybe you could speak to that.
Yes. What a wonderful, thank you. What a wonderful question. So well put. My mother, in a sense, denied me my father. I couldn't talk about him. I couldn't mention him. It was completely taboo. We never could have a conversation about him. Ever. And she never told me why we couldn't have a conversation about him. Like, hey, we're not talking about him. I know you know who he exists. We went to court, and at one horrible court appearance, the judge asks me, do you love your father? This is Charles Zimmerman. And at the time, I yearned for him. Nobody had ever used the word father with me to refer to him. And I said, yes, I love him. Meaning I just didn't want it to be that I would never see him. And I looked at her, and her face was black. And of course, I had said the wrong thing, and I had to have a visitation with him, and it led to no good because she wasn't going to let me see him. I didn't know why. So that ended. And anyway, he got taken out of my life. And she died when I was a junior in college. She died very young. She died when she was 49. I had just turned 19. And we never had a conversation about why. And it wasn't until I had gotten my first job at MIT. I think I was 30 when I decided I'm going to find him. I'm going to take my money from my first job, and I'm going to find this man. I hired a detective, and I found him and realized that there was a reason that she had kept him from me. And there's a spoiler alert here. There was something wrong with him. He was someone who had performed And this is the spoiler alert, he had performed Skinner-type experiments on me as a child when she had found him at these awful experiments. She had left with me, picked me up, called my aunt, who was the only one in my family who had a car, and had packed some diapers and a few things in some paper bags, and had left to return to her parents, and had not told anyone about these experiments. I was the only one who knew about these experiments because when I found him all these years later, he told me. So really, this was a secret that only my mother and I shared because she hadn't told her parents. It was shameful to tell them. She hadn't told her sister. She hadn't told the court because I have the court documents. And she hadn't wanted to tell the court because I later heard from rabbis that she felt that if she had shared this with anyone, I might be considered tainted and unmarriageable because I would have been a child of someone not all there. So this was her terrible secret. And only 30 years later did I find out, when I met him, about this secret. And when I found my father and found out why she had left him, I found my father, but lost him really as someone who would ever be a parent to me, because he still didn't see the problem with his experiments. He was kind of annoyed she had left because his only response was that he was willing to offer her co-credit in the publications he was going to write about the experiments. He was still completely into his publishing the results of his work, and she could be co-author or whatever. I lost the fantasy of this father, but I gained a connection to her. I could now be empathic with her. And that's really why the book is called The Empathy Diaries, because that was the empathic relationship that I'd been missing all my life, was a true empathic connection with her. And now I had it. And I think that was the healing moment for me, is that now I had the empathic relationship with my mother that I'd been missing all my life. I knew, I still think that it would have been better if she could have spoken with me, but she could not. But I now understood what was on her mind. And I had a deep reconciliation with my mother that freed me. It freed me. I became it's silly. It's silly to say I became a different person, but I was freed to go on with my life in a different register after that happened.
It's wonderful to have discovered that she was trying to protect you,
yes,
rather than just herself.
Yes.
Which you might have thought. Yeah.
Yes, and also I sensed her deep aloneness. In other words, she did not know what to do with this information. She thought honestly that it was so toxic as information that she couldn't tell her parents, she couldn't tell her sister. She had heard from a rabbi that even the fact of it might mean that I couldn't marry, that I would be tainted, it was something so terrible that she needed to keep it a secret. I don't think, I can't even imagine her confusion and upset. So she just hid it. And I think it says something about that moment in time, her lack of information, her aloneness. And so I felt, how many of us have been alone with something where we are so, I just felt a deep compassion for her, a deep love for her. She became my heroine. She took me out of a place where truly I could have been deeply damaged, because these experiments were of a very toxic nature. And as soon as she knew of them, she picked me up,
Right.
took a bag, took some A&P bags, stuffed them with some diapers, and we were gone.
Yes. Yeah, she knew instantly that this was dangerous.
Yes.
So Empathy Diaries also works as a time machine, taking us back to women at universities in the 60s and 70s and the constraints on them. So I'm thinking about the restrictions on you at Radcliffe with regard to the Harvard Library. I'm also thinking about the later story when you were at MIT when Steve Jobs came to visit.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could tell us those stories.
Yes. Well, I started Radcliffe in 1965 as a freshman. And I tell the story of not being able to use the undergraduate library in Harvard Yard. And there was no place to go to the bathroom in Harvard Yard or read in Harvard Yard, except for a basement kind of underground cubby in the basement of Memorial Church. There was an underground, I don't know if we have any Cliffies in the audience. There was a basement room under Memorial Church where Radcliffe had, I don't know, rented or had been given a room and a bathroom. It was really dank and dark. I think it had like a little like a little basement window. And between classes, you could read there and wait for your next class, and go to the bathroom and just wait for your next class. And then there was what I talk about, not noticing how bad that was, because things that you have to sort of be out of the situation in order to know that that was kind of bad. I just felt lucky. I just felt lucky to be there. It was just sort of part of being lucky, feeling lucky to be there at all. And
then it sounds like later with Steve Jobs,
later,
you also felt lucky.
Right, exactly. I mean, I used to say, why can't I be in experiments that were being done at William James Hall psychological experiments? I was told that, well, women couldn't be in experiments because they were based on male soldiers and kind of titrated for male soldiers, and that seemed natural too. I mean, really, you have to be out of the situation and not having grown up in the situation in order to see the situation. And then when I started as a professor at MIT, I was the only woman, certainly in my department. There were a few women in chemistry, but there were very few women. Certainly, I was the only one in my department. Steve Jobs, when I was studying, really his insight that computers were going to be really changed how we thought and were going to be part of our aesthetic life and our way of thinking. He was at MIT to talk to the faculty and to have meetings with the faculty members. And I wasn't invited to any of these meetings, even though I was studying his thing. And instead of being invited to meet him, I was asked to make dinner for him and faculty members. And I tell the story in the book, and I make no comment about it. But actually, I didn't notice at the time that I wasn't asked to meet with him. I was only asked to have dinner with him. And even as I wrote the book, I was so into putting myself into that moment in time that I didn't even comment on it. And only after the book was in what's called blues, and it's too late to make any changes. I said to my editor, well, I really should say how odd this was. And she said, well, it's too late. And I said, well, shouldn't I say that that's how odd? It was like too late to even comment that I hadn't even seen as I was writing it up, that how odd this was, but I think it's kind of better the way it is. It shows you how I'm so completely in the moment that I don't even see that I'm I'm treated like not quite a faculty member. I'm treated like, I make cookies.
Cafeteria staff.
I'm treated like somebody who'll make cookies for faculty meetings and make dinner for visiting dignitaries. And what's amazing is that I'm asked to make him a vegetarian dinner. And of course, I was not like a great vegetarian cook. So I do my best, and he comes to the meeting, he comes to my dinner, and there's all these dignitaries, Nobel Prize winners. And I mean, it's like, I have this little apartment in the Back Bay. I mean, I'm like an assistant, I'm a lowly assistant professor, and I've cooked I have this vegetarian meal. And he comes in and he looks at the meal and he says, "I'm not that kind of vegetarian," and he walks out. So it was a very Steve Jobs moment that even though not only wasn't I invited to meet him, but I couldn't even do the womanly vegetarian dinner thing appropriately. So I failed at everything. But it's a good example of how, being a woman faculty in the 1970s was not an easy road. And I think it's an honest moment in that it took me a while to find my feminist orientation, because again, my attitude was lucky to be there because Harvard didn't even have any women on the faculty while I was going through the graduate school there. There were no tenured women on the Harvard faculty. So my orientation was lucky. This was pre looking for women, kind of. And so I think, again, that the phrase I use in the book is a French phrase, dépaysement, decountrifying, making the world strange to you. You have to be able to step out of the world you're in to see it with fresh eyes in order to be able to critique it and to find a new vantage point, to be able to see it critically. And that's one of the things I try to do in the book, is to show how we're at a moment in the life of this country where we have an opportunity to see our own country with fresh eyes at a very crucial and very dangerous moment in the life of this country, and how important that is. And I try to do that by showing the moments in my life when it was important to step back and see the world with fresh eyes.
Yeah, and I think you do it very effectively. We're going to jump from Steve Jobs to Henry David Thoreau.
Okay.
So I understand that. I know you're a person who appreciates technology. You're not your message is not, let's destroy all the smartphones. And instead, you have a message that channels Henry David Thoreau, even though Thoreau was this 19th century guy who never saw a computer. You still feel he has something to teach us about life on the screen. And I wondered if you could speak to that.
Yes. Well, Thoreau, people like to joke that Thoreau at Walden could hear Emerson's dinner bell, and in fact had dinner with Emerson very often while he was in his, solitary confinement, when he was at Walden. And what Thoreau was trying to say was not talking about retreat. His message really was about deliberateness. And I try to talk about deliberateness and making deliberate choices as really what Thoreau has to teach us for now. Is that he wanted us to, in society, make our choices about how we communicated and with whom we communicated be deliberate, not just that we were bumping up against each other, but that how we were together should be deliberate choices. And I think that's what we really need to do when we make decisions, for example, now about Facebook. Uh, what is it that we want from social media? What is it that we want teens to have on Instagram? Uh, it should be deliberate now. We should be thinking about social media, democracy. We should be thinking about the relationship between intimacy, democracy, um, and privacy in a deliberate way. That's what I meant, I think, when I was said, just because we grew up with the internet, we think the internet is all grown up. Uh, Now it's time for deliberateness, and that's really Thoreau's message. Another message of Thoreau that I talked a lot about, both in this book and in my last book, Reclaiming Conversation, is Thoreau talked about his cabin in a metaphorical way. He said, "I have 3 chairs in my cabin, one for solitude, for 3 kinds of conversation. One for solitude." And he talked about the kinds of conversations you could have in those 3 chairs. And he emphasized the importance of a chair of solitude as being one of he emphasized the relationship between solitude and conversation. That is to say that you need to be able to have solitude and be able to one chair in his cabin was the conversations of solitude, because without solitude you can't know you come to other people looking to them to tell you who you are. You need to be able to know yourself to be able to come to people really ready to listen to them and engage in true mutuality. So for Thoreau, being able to withdraw and know yourself was a stepping stone to the chairs in which you come to other people ready to listen to them empathically without imposing yourself on them. And I think that's a very important message for today, because what having the internet always on you, always in our ear, always on our phone, is it undermines our capacity for solitude. And I think that this Thoreau message of being able to develop the capacity for solitude, not just to have solitude, but to be able to come to other people for the purpose of true conversation, is really a message we need now more than ever. So I don't preach solitude to be alone. I preach solitude, the capacity for solitude, so that we can be together, really able to listen to each other. And we're losing the capacity for solitude. Children are losing the capacity for solitude because they're bombarded from the youngest ages by this always on you material, so that they lose the capacity to just be alone with themselves. And I think that's very dangerous, very, very dangerous, because it really is in solitude that empathy is born. And that's that's a great message of the Empathy Diaries, that we can't afford to lose our capacity for empathy, and we have to watch out for it. I hope that answers your.
Yes.
Thoreau I've written so much about Thoreau. Thoreau is kind of I'm trying to condense. I'm struggling here. I'm trying to condense my many Thoreau stories. Also, I spent the days of COVID on the beach that Thoreau walked. He lived at Walden, but he also walked the beach of Cape Cod from Sandwich to Provincetown, and I spent the pandemic at a cottage in Provincetown on the beach that Thoreau walked. So I got even deeper into Thoreau mythology, and he has much to teach us.
Yes, that was one of the reasons I asked that question.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask one more thing, and then Marge has a question, and then the audience has questions.
Okay.
So let me just ask you about the pandemic, because you studied with a famous anthropologist who was very interested in liminal times, threshold times, betwixt and between times, when old norms were fading away and the future was still open. And for you and others, the May 68 protests in France and the digital revolution, those were examples of liminal times. But I wonder, do you think that the pandemic or its aftermath is a liminal time?
Yes. And actually, I've written about this extensively. For those of you who are interested, if you type, I think, Sherry Turkle Time Magazine, I wrote a whole essay. I both wrote about it in Empathy Diaries, and then I wrote more about it. I was so into this. I wrote an essay about this that was published in Time Magazine, because I think it's so important that we are now living in a time that is both frightening, but has possibilities. A liminal time is a time when old norms are dissolving. And I think we see that and we're shocked. I mean, an insurrection at the Capitol, Supreme Court justices we won't nominate them, I mean, frightening things going on politically. Things that, the results of elections, well, we won't believe the election, we'll deny. I mean, I don't want to go into the litany of political things that terrify me. And so we see the negative. And then you can also say, well, these rules are being broken, but okay, in this time of rule breaking, it's also an opportunity to say, let's really look at this society. Rules are being broken that are good rules to be broken. The way women are treated in corporations, the way women, the way, Black Lives Matter and, Me Too. I mean, there are a lot of rules are being up for grabs. It's an opportunity that everybody can take to make something new here. It's not just an opportunity for authoritarianism. We treat this as only an opportunity. Sometimes people say, well, it's only an opportunity for authoritarianism. No, it's an opportunity for everyone to say, what new can we build here? And I think that the danger is that people get so frightened that they see it as only an opportunity for authoritarianism. But in these liminal betwixt and between moments, it's also an opportunity for progressivism. It's an opportunity for everyone to build something genuinely new and to imagine new ways. And it can be a very frightening moment, but I try to kind of use these theories of betwixt and between, theorists who've written extensively about them, to contextualize the positive aspects of such moments and say it's time for everyone to dream. And if you just get kind of freaked out by how authoritarians can profit from these moments, you can, people who are dreaming of more progressive societies can stop dreaming because they get so frightened. So this is something that I've written about and care very deeply about. And, we live in a country where, we're not used to the reassertion, the robust reassertion of such authoritarianism on the right, but it also can be a moment for tremendous reassertion of positivity by progressive forces. So I'm very happy for this question, and I think that yes, I've studied with people who have devoted their lives to the investigation of these betwixt and between moments, and I'd be interested in people looking at that Time magazine essay, and I think it is an assertion of the possibilities of this kind of time. And I really go into it in the Empathy Diaries because I think that, I wrote it during the pandemic, and I think it bears the trace of the pandemic, even though it wasn't a book about the pandemic.
Yes, yeah, no, that comes across. And actually, to the audience, I could send you as a third bonus drop the Time magazine article.
Oh, that's good.
Because it is very good. So, Marge, you have been so patient because I happily monopolized.
I just want to say thank you for these wonderful questions. These questions have just been really, Robin, these questions have just been a joy, a joy. You were such a close reader of my work. I'm so appreciative.
Well, I appreciate your book and your work and your life. And so the gratitude is on my side.